They found her diary sealed in a rotting chest beneath the floorboards of an abandoned plantation house outside Montgomery. The ink had bled into the paper like veins, desperate, trembling words that should have been lost to time. It began with a single line: "Freedom has a price, and his body will pay it." The year was 1848. The woman's name was Catherine Barlow, the last surviving heiress of one of Alabama's oldest families, a lineage steeped in cotton, cruelty, and decay. But buried in that empire was a secret so twisted it had to be written in code, disguised as confession. Catherine had promised one of her slaves, a man named Isaac, something no one in her bloodline had ever given before: freedom. But there was a condition. A horrifying condition. Before we go any deeper into this story, pause for a moment. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the bell icon, because what's coming next will change the way you see history forever. And I want to know something from you. Where in the world are you listening to this right now? Tell me in the comments below. Let me see who's awake out there walking this path with me. In the diary, she wrote of dreams that haunted her, voices that whispered of cleansing bloodlines, of breaking curses passed down through generations. The plantation was dying. Her father's wealth was gone, the crops rotted, and the daughter she bore, Eleanor, was sick, pale, silent, seeing things no child should see. Catherine became convinced that the only way to free her family from its curse was through creation, through blood itself. So she approached Isaac, a man she'd known since childhood, intelligent, quiet, loyal. She told him if he would sleep with her, and then with her daughter when she came of age, she would grant him freedom, and the unborn child, the one born of both lines, slave and mistress, would redeem the sins of the house. No court record mentions this. No historian has ever confirmed it. The plantation burned in 1864, and nearly everything vanished with it. But the diary remains, and in its pages lies something that chills deeper than any ghost story: the portrait of a woman corrupted not only by her own power, but by the belief that suffering could purify blood. This is not the story of slavery you were taught in school. This is what happens when human lives become currency for salvation, and when a promise of freedom becomes a ritual of possession. Before Catherine Barlow's name dissolved into rumor and ash, her family's history had already been written in blood. The Barlows were not just planters. They were collectors of people, of power, of secrets. They came to Alabama in 1819, dragging with them more than just slaves. They carried heirlooms from Virginia, ledgers filled with the names of men and women bought and sold like livestock, and journals of strange rituals that blurred Christianity with something far older, something never spoken aloud. In those pages, one phrase appeared again and again: the cleansing of the line. It was a twisted theology that the Barlows whispered only among themselves, that God had cursed their blood for some unspoken crime committed generations earlier. That curse could only be lifted, they believed, through a union of opposites, the merging of the pure and the condemned. By the time Catherine was born, that doctrine had mutated into something monstrous. She grew up in a decaying mansion where sermons mixed with superstition, and faith was a tool of control. Her father, Reverend Thomas Barlow, preached freedom in church and practiced slavery at home. He told her that obedience was godliness, that suffering was divine, and that a woman's body was her tithe to the family's redemption. So when Catherine later looked at Isaac, she didn't see a man. She saw prophecy, a living key to end generations of guilt. Isaac was everything the Barlows despised: intelligent, proud, unbroken, and that made him dangerous. He read secretly when no one watched. He carved small symbols into the beams of the smokehouse, circles with crosses inside, signs of protection from older African rites. Catherine saw them, and something inside her shifted. The lines between guilt and desire began to blur, between salvation and control. She wrote that she dreamt of him long before she approached him, dreamt of hands that built touching hands that burned.
She believed he had been chosen, not just by her desperation, but by the curse itself. In the summer of 1848, she began to test him. Small privileges at first, a book, a key, a meal at the edge of her table. Power turned to intimacy, intimacy to obsession. She told him finally that freedom would come through her, but she didn't mean emancipation. She meant rebirth, in her blood, through her body, and through the unholy promise she would make.
It began on a night when the air hung heavy with heat and silence, the kind of silence that feels alive, watching. The other slaves had been sent to the quarters early. Catherine dismissed the servants and locked every door behind her. She wrote later that she could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock like the pulse of judgment. Isaac stood in the hallway, unsure why he had been summoned after dark. He was strong, tall, quiet, a man who had learned the power of silence in a house built on secrets. Catherine told him her daughter was ill. She needed his help, but that wasn't the truth. The sickness was in her, not Eleanor. She led him to her father's study, a place he'd never been allowed to enter. The room smelled of cedar and old paper. Portraits of dead men stared from the walls, their eyes painted too bright, too knowing. Catherine's hands shook as she poured 2 glasses of whiskey. "Sit," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't blink. She told him the story of the curse, of her father's last words before his death. "Our freedom lies in the sin we fear most." Isaac listened. He said nothing. He had heard the Barlows speak in tongues before, praying to a God that looked more like power than mercy. But this time was different. Catherine wasn't preaching. She was begging. Not for his obedience, but for his part in something she called redemption. When he refused, she changed the tone. The promise came next, whispered low, like a confession. If he did what she asked, she would give him papers of freedom, signed and sealed. She would give him land. She would end his bondage, but only if he gave her a child. She said she had seen it in her dreams, a child born of night and day, the one to break the blood. Isaac didn't answer. She reached for him. He froze, torn between rage and survival. He knew what refusal meant in that world, that even resistance could be rewritten as guilt, that his silence could be twisted into consent. When the clock struck midnight, the house stood still. No one spoke, no one screamed. Only the floorboards creaked, and the sound of something sacred being broken echoed into the dark. She wrote later that he wept, and that she believed those tears were the sound of the curse leaving us both. But curses don't leave, they grow roots. By dawn, the house seemed quieter than it should have been. Too quiet, as if the walls themselves were listening for what had changed inside them. Catherine moved through the corridors like someone waking from a fevered dream, her nightdress torn, her hands trembling. She claimed she felt cleansed, yet her reflection refused to meet her eyes. Isaac did not appear at breakfast. He was gone to the fields before the sun rose, his back rigid, his silence absolute. Those who saw him that morning whispered that he worked faster than anyone else, as though trying to erase the night by drowning it in sweat and dirt. But Catherine couldn't forget. Each day she found a new reason to summon him, first to the stables, then to the kitchen, then again to her father's study. Her obsession deepened, but what she called faith was something darker, control dressed as redemption. She began to speak of him not as a man, but as a vessel, the bridge between 2 condemned worlds. Within weeks, she was certain she carried his child. Her letters from that period became fragmented, desperate, fevered. She wrote of the serpent leaving the tree, of blood uniting heaven and clay. The language bordered on madness,
Yet behind it lurked a truth she could not face. She had taken what she claimed to give. Isaac, meanwhile, was dying in another way, not in body, but in the erosion of his name. He stopped singing in the fields. He stopped speaking at all. The overseers mocked him, sensing weakness, and when Catherine began visiting the quarters at night, pretending to bring food, the others understood. They saw what he could not escape, that freedom had become another chain. Then came Eleanor, the child, barely 15, fragile and already haunted by her mother's shadow. Catherine began telling her that Isaac carried holy blood, that he was chosen, and when Eleanor cried, Catherine struck her, screaming that the line must be healed. It was no longer just sin, it was ritual. The curse had consumed them all, mother, daughter, slave, bound together by a promise that was never meant to be kept. And in the silence of those fields, something began to stir. Rumors, eyes watching, whispers of rebellion. Because when power turns to madness, even the enslaved begin to wonder which soul is truly in chains.
The people of Montgomery whispered long before they ever saw proof. Servants who came down from the hill at dawn brought strange stories. How the Barlow house never slept anymore. How candles burned through the night behind drawn curtains. How Catherine's laughter echoed through empty halls long after everyone else had gone quiet. The women at church crossed themselves when her name was spoken. The men said nothing, but they noticed the change in Isaac, the way he avoided the square, the way his shoulders carried an invisible weight heavier than chains. By midsummer, something about the land itself began to shift. The crops wilted for no reason. Livestock refused to eat. Visitors said they felt cold even under the Alabama sun. Catherine called it the cleansing, a sign that the curse was breaking. But to everyone else, it felt like rot creeping outward from the house. Reverend Collins, an old family friend, rode up from town one evening to pray over the estate. He lasted less than an hour. When he returned, he told his wife that Catherine's eyes had changed color in the candlelight, gray turning almost silver, and that she spoke in a voice not her own. He never went back. Isaac knew the eyes were only the beginning. Catherine no longer hid her delusions, she demanded them. She started making him kneel before her as she recited verses she had rewritten herself, words that twisted scripture into something unrecognizable. She promised he was the new Adam and that his suffering would set them all free. He wanted to run, but she held the papers of his freedom, written, signed, and locked in her father's desk. The key hung on a chain around her neck. Eleanor watched it all in silence. She had grown sickly pale, thin, and sleepless. She followed her mother through the halls like a shadow, whispering to herself. Some nights, she stood outside Isaac's quarters, humming lullabies that weren't hers. Catherine called her the vessel. The servants began to call her the ghost. The local doctor was summoned once, but he refused to enter the upstairs rooms. He said some things should stay buried. And that's when Catherine made her second promise, one that would bind the curse forever, that when Eleanor came of age, Isaac would lie with her too. 2 generations, she wrote, and the line will be made whole. It was no longer redemption she sought. It was immortality through corruption. The night Isaac chose to flee, the sky was black and airless, one of those southern nights where even the insects go silent. He had gathered everything he owned into a torn sack, a small Bible, a piece of carved bone, a handful of cornmeal. His plan was simple. He would head east toward the river, where he'd heard whispers of an abolitionist network that ferried runaways north. But the closer he moved to the door, the more the house seemed to breathe around him. The walls groaned, the floorboards moaned like someone whispering from beneath. He froze when the clock in the hall began to tick backward, the pendulum swinging against time itself. He told himself it was fear. Then he heard the laughter, soft, distant, unmistakable. Catherine's voice. "You can't run from salvation," it whispered. When he reached for the handle, the door swung open by itself. The corridor was dark, except for a single candle burning in front of the portrait of Reverend Barlow. The flame leaned toward him, though no wind stirred. And in that moment, Isaac saw something impossible. The painted eyes of the Reverend seemed wet, alive, as if watching. He ran. Down the hall, past the parlor, into the kitchen. Every window was latched from the outside. He smashed one open with his shoulder and dropped into the yard. The night was heavy with mist, the fields white and ghost-like. He made it halfway to the tree line before he saw her. Catherine stood barefoot in the grass, her nightgown stained, her hair unbound. The moonlight caught the key around her neck. It glowed faintly, as though lit from within. "You think you can take my freedom?" she said, voice calm, detached. "But I already gave it to you. It's inside you now. Running won't free you. It'll kill you." Isaac backed away, but she didn't move. She raised her hands and began to pray, or maybe curse. The language was neither English nor scripture. The air thickened. The sound of wings or screams or both filled the distance. He bolted into the woods. Branches tore at his face. The mist grew thicker until the moon vanished. Behind him, the house groaned like a wounded animal, its windows flickering in rhythm with her chant. Then, a sudden silence, deep and total. When he looked back, the plantation was gone. Only darkness remained, and in the distance, a single light swinging through the trees, like someone carrying a lantern, calling his name. He didn't stop running until his legs gave out, but the key, its glow, still burned behind his eyes. Isaac stumbled through the forest until the trees began to thin and the smell of wet stone replaced the scent of pine. His lungs burned, his hands slick with blood and bark. Then he saw it, a ruin half swallowed by vines, the bones of an old chapel long forgotten by God and man alike. The roof had collapsed decades ago. Only the bell tower still stood, cracked open like a grave marker, pointing toward the sky. He didn't know why he went inside. Maybe instinct, maybe fate. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air grew colder, not with night, but with memory. The pews were gone, replaced by piles of earth and moss. The altar was broken, and behind it, carved into the stone floor, was the same spiral he'd been marking beneath the doorframes at the plantation, the same symbol his grandmother once drew in the dirt to keep the bad spirits away. Except here, it was inverted. Someone, long ago, had taken the mark of protection and turned it inside out, a symbol of reversal, of binding instead of freeing. And in the center of that spiral, buried in the dust, lay a small metal box half eaten by rust. Inside was a collection of items that should never have been together. A rosary with blackened beads, a lock of pale hair, and a folded parchment marked with the Barlow seal. The letter was addressed to Reverend Thomas Barlow, Catherine's father. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp, slanted, almost frantic.
You have made the pact. You have taken the sacred blood. The curse is sealed in the womb of your line. Only through uniting what you divided will it be broken. Isaac's breath caught. The words repeated the same twisted theology Catherine had spoken, the merging of opposites, the redemption through defilement. But the signature at the bottom stopped him cold. E. Collins. Reverend Elijah Collins. The same Catherine's father had called his brother in Christ, the same preacher who had visited their home before his own mysterious death, the same Collins whose family once owned land just beyond these woods. His church, his altar. The truth came crashing in like thunder. The curse wasn't born of madness, it was inherited, an unholy covenant between two preachers who believed salvation could be manufactured through flesh and blood. Catherine wasn't the first to follow it, she was its latest vessel. The promise of redemption wasn't a delusion, it was a legacy, centuries old, passed down through scripture rewritten in the dark. The spiral on the floor began to shimmer faintly, reacting to the blood dripping from Isaac's hands. The air trembled. He stepped back, too late. The walls groaned, and a voice, smooth and cold as oil, echoed through the ruin. You carry both chains now. You cannot run from what was made inside you.
The voice faded, but the echo of it kept circling the stone walls like a breath that refused to die. Isaac forced himself to move, though the air around him felt thick as water. The letter still trembled in his hand. Beneath the Reverend's signature, there was a symbol, a pair of interlocked circles, one light, one dark, crossing at the center. Underneath, 3 words in Latin, per mixturam redemptio, through mingling, redemption. He understood then what Catherine had inherited. The pact was never about God's mercy. It was about control, the reshaping of blood, the merging of the master and the mastered, until no one could tell which soul commanded the other. A creed born not of love, but of possession. He found other scraps of parchment beneath the altar, records written by the first Barlow patriarch. They spoke of ceremonies performed to bind the house in balance. Each generation, a chosen vessel was to offer what was pure to what was condemned, and from their joining, power would be renewed. The words were careful, symbolic, almost liturgical, but Isaac felt the rot beneath them. The offering was not faith, it was flesh turned into a language of obedience. He saw it clearly now. Catherine was repeating a rite older than her understanding, a script whispered from one keeper to the next until the words lost their shape and became hunger. She believed she was healing a wound. In truth, she was feeding it. As he read, the chapel seemed to breathe again. Dust rose from the floor like incense, and the spiral at his feet glowed faintly red. He whispered a prayer, half in English, half in the tongue of his ancestors, that whatever power still lingered would turn its face away from him. But the answer came in a whisper that wasn't hers or his. The line binds all who touch it. To break it, blood must answer blood. He folded the letter, tucked it into his coat, and turned toward the door. The wind outside carried the faint sound of bells, though no church remained to ring them. Somewhere behind him, the spiral dimmed, waiting for the next name to complete the circle. Isaac knew then that the curse wasn't a haunting. It was inheritance, belief sharpened into bondage, and he would have to return to the plantation to end it. The storm rolled in fast, carrying with it the smell of metal and the sound of the earth waking up. Lightning tore across the horizon, white veins crawling through the sky. Inside the house, the fire sputtered and hissed as the letter turned to ash. The air thickened, pressing against Isaac's chest like a hand trying to stop his heartbeat. Catherine stood motionless, eyes wide, watching the smoke spiral upward. For a moment, she seemed small, human again, terrified even. But the voice that came from her lips was not her own. "You think paper can burn a covenant?" it said, low and hollow. "The pact was written in flesh, in faith, in the very breath you take." Isaac didn't answer. He moved slowly toward Eleanor, who was still trembling by the fireplace. Her eyes darted between them, confusion and fear warring inside her. He whispered her name and she blinked, as if waking from a long dream. Then the floor trembled. The portraits on the walls began to hum, a deep vibration that seemed to come from inside the wood. Catherine screamed, clutching her head, and the key around her neck snapped from its chain, falling into the ashes. The glow that once surrounded it flickered and died. The house itself seemed to react. The air rushed outward, as though something vast and ancient had been released from the walls. Dust lifted from the floor in spirals, spinning faster, merging with the smoke from the fire. Within that haze, shapes began to form. Faces, countless faces, layered one atop another. The generations of the Barlow line. Not ghosts, not quite memories, impressions. The weight of what had been done in their name. Catherine fell to her knees. "They're free," she whispered. "I can feel them leaving me." But Isaac saw something else. The spiral in the dust had reversed itself, turning outward instead of inward. The curse wasn't consuming, it was releasing. He stepped closer, placed his hand on Catherine's shoulder and said quietly, "Then let them go." Outside, the thunder cracked like a final word. The window shattered inward, wind and rain rushing through the room. The faces in the smoke faded one by one, until only silence remained. When it was over, Catherine lay still, eyes closed, a faint smile frozen on her lips. Eleanor stood at the edge of the ruined circle, her face streaked with tears. "Is it over?" she asked. Isaac looked toward the open doorway where dawn was beginning to break through the clouds. "Curses don't end," he said. "They change shape, but they don't own us anymore." He picked up the broken key from the ashes and pressed it into Eleanor's hand. "Keep this," he told her, "not as a chain, as a reminder." And as the rain fell through the shattered roof, washing the dust from the floor, the house that had held them all finally began to collapse, not from fire or rage, but from release. They walked away, before the sun climbed high enough to burn the mist from the fields. Isaac didn't look back. The house cracked and settled behind them, timbers sighing like something that had waited too long to die. The rain made their clothes heavy and their footsteps soft. They passed the empty quarters, the broken fences, the orchard that had gone wild, branches twisting over themselves, fruit rotting where it fell. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, the plantation was gone from sight, swallowed by gray. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was the rain. Then Eleanor asked quietly, "What happens now?" Isaac didn't answer right away. He thought of all the names written in ledgers, all the stories that would never be told. "We keep walking," he said at last. "And when people ask what happened there, we tell them the truth that can be told." Eleanor frowned. "And the rest?" He looked at her. The daughter of the woman who had tried to bind him, the last of a house built on possession,
and saw not corruption, but possibility. "The rest," he said, "we leave in the ground." They walked for 2 days before reaching the river. A ferryman, an older man with eyes like smoke, took them across without question. When he looked back toward the west bank, he said, "That land's cursed, Been that way longer than I've been alive." Isaac nodded but didn't reply. He understood now that curses aren't things that live in soil. They live in belief. The Barlows had carried their curse in their prayers, their greed, their need to own what they feared. And belief, once it finds a home, doesn't die easily. It just waits for someone new to speak its name. Years later, travelers would pass the ruins and tell stories of a woman who tried to bargain with God, of a servant who burned her house to ash, of a storm that never ended. They'd see strange symbols in the stone and talk of a spiral carved by hands not human. They'd say the spirits still walked there, whispering of blood and redemption. But none of them would know the truth, that the curse had never been about spirits or bloodlines. It was about what people do when they mistake power for salvation. Isaac and Eleanor disappeared into the north. Some said they changed their names, others that they died crossing the mountains. But those who listened closely to the wind on certain nights swore they heard 2 voices, one old, one young, repeating the same words over and over, like a prayer meant to break the pattern forever. "We are not what was promised. We are what remains."
Time buried the land, but not the story. After the war, surveyors came to map what was left of the Barlow property. They found nothing but vines and blackened stone. The house was gone, the fields reclaimed by forest. But every man who worked that survey quit within a week. One swore he heard voices whispering scripture backwards. Another said he found a small iron key buried in the mud, cold as bone, shining even without light. The land was left alone for nearly 80 years. Then, in 1927, a new owner appeared, Reverend James E. Collins, descendant of the same preacher who'd helped birth the curse a century before. He claimed he'd been called by vision to rebuild a church on the very ground where the Barlow plantation once stood. He said the land was holy, ready to be cleansed. The locals, poor and desperate, believed him. They helped raise the new chapel, stone by stone. And when the first service began, the Reverend told his congregation that sin could be washed away only by joining the divided blood. He called it the doctrine of completion. No one understood what it meant, but his voice carried weight. His followers began wearing small spirals carved in wood around their necks. Those who questioned him disappeared quietly. Their families told they had moved on to redemption. Within a decade, the church became the heart of a strange sect that spread through Alabama's back roads like roots under soil. Outsiders called them the Circle Church. Members called themselves the Bound. They spoke of light and shadow made one, the cleansing through unity, and the promise of the returning vessel. By 1936, state investigators tried to intervene. What they found in the chapel's basement made the newspapers for a single day before the story was hushed. All records were destroyed, except one photograph. It showed the Reverend standing before his flock, eyes glinting silver in the flash, holding a single relic, an iron key, blackened but unbroken. The same key Catherine had once worn. After that, the church vanished overnight. The building burned to the ground. Every member disappeared. The land was declared unfit for settlement. Locals claimed the soil refused to grow anything but thorns. But sometimes, travelers on Highway 41 said they saw lights deep in the trees, lanterns swinging in rhythm, tracing circles in the dark. And always, always, the faint echo of a prayer. Through mingling, redemption. For decades, the Barlow land lay hidden under vines and silence, a blank patch on state maps. In 1972, the county sold the acreage to a development company out of Birmingham that promised a luxury retreat, golf course, lodges, man-made lake. The surveyors who returned were young, armed with blueprints and confidence. They didn't believe in curses. They believed in progress. The first bulldozer broke ground on a Wednesday morning. By Friday, the machinery had stalled 3 times for no mechanical reason. The foreman called in a geologist who discovered veins of black clay running beneath the soil in perfect spirals. The men laughed and said it was coincidence and poured concrete anyway. 2 weeks later, one of the workers vanished. His boots were found at the edge of the lake bed, their soles packed with salt. The company changed names twice that year. Finally, a university archaeology team arrived, claiming historical interest. They excavated near the ruins of the old chapel and found fragments of pottery, rusted tools, and bones, not scattered like a grave, but arranged carefully in circles, every skull facing inward. The state ordered the dig sealed. The official report cited native ceremonial remains. Off the record, the lead archaeologist burned his notes and resigned. When the story resurfaced in 1991, it wasn't archaeologists who stirred the ground, it was biologists. A private research group leased part of the property to study regional genetic drift. They collected blood samples from local families, descendants of both landowners and enslaved people. The goal, they said, was to trace inherited immunity markers, but their findings never went public. One technician leaked a single page before disappearing. The document referenced an anomaly, a recurring mutation appearing only in families tied to 2 surnames, Barlow and Collins. The margin carried a note in handwriting that didn't belong to any of the researchers. The line endures. The key is in the blood. After that leak, funding was withdrawn, equipment abandoned. The trailers still sit in the clearing, their doors chained, papers scattered inside. Locals say on hot nights you can hear the hum of generators that no longer exist, lights flickering through cracked windows. It's said one of the researchers stayed behind, a woman who believed the mutation wasn't biological, but spiritual, coded into belief itself. She tried to record the frequencies that pulse through the ground after midnight. Her last tape ends with a whisper. It's not a curse anymore. It's a system. When federal archives were quietly unsealed in the early 2000s, a few curious researchers began cross-referencing what remained of the Barlow project. What they found was not science, not really. It was pattern tracking. Old plantation records, census data, property deeds, church rosters, DNA studies, and psychological surveys. Every generation of the Barlow-Collins line had been observed by someone, preachers, doctors, agents. No one ever said why. The files referred to it only as the system of balance. The notes described an experiment that was never declared, one that began long before laboratories existed. Its premise was simple, monstrous, and perfectly modern. If faith can control a man, belief can replicate itself like blood. Over time, the creed that birthed the curse had become a formula. How to shape obedience through fear, how to make people worship the chains that hold them. It was no longer about a family. It was about a model for civilization.
Within the archives lay pages of diagrams, spirals dissected like blueprints of the human mind. Each circle represented a generation, each crossing point a moment when control was re-established. Religion, government, industry, media. At the center, the same Latin phrase appeared again, per mixturam redemptio, through mingling, redemption. Not of flesh this time, but of thought. The merging of truth and lie until neither could be separated. That was the real curse, the perfection of manipulation. The more the researchers read, the more they saw the pattern everywhere. Slogans, prayers, political campaigns, marketing studies. Language engineered to fuse opposites, freedom through obedience, peace through fear, unity through division. It was the spiral reborn, not in stone, but in ideology. Then came the disappearances. 3 researchers from the archival team vanished within months. Their computers were wiped, their names removed from payroll. The last message one of them sent to a colleague contained a single line. The Circle Church never ended. It evolved. Locals near the old Barlow land began reporting unmarked trucks arriving at night. No lights, no plates. They said you could hear low-frequency vibrations rolling across the ground like a heartbeat under the soil. The power company denied any activity. The county sheriff resigned. And in the ruins of the chapel, someone or something had etched a new spiral into the concrete, perfectly smooth, perfectly symmetrical. At its center lay a small iron key, not blackened this time, but polished, waiting. Because every system needs a start again. In the years that followed, the spiral began appearing in places that had never heard of Alabama. First it surfaced online, subtle, hidden in the corner of digital art, in corporate logos, in the background of advertisements that most people scrolled past without seeing. A shape that looked familiar but carried a rhythm that pulled the eye inward just for a moment. You might have seen it yourself, not even knowing. At first, researchers dismissed it as pareidolia, the mind finding patterns where none existed. But a few data analysts noticed something stranger. People who fixated on the symbol tended to stay longer on the page, buy more products, believe the headlines more easily. It wasn't magic. It was psychology. Attention compressed into faith. The same principle that had bound the Barlows to their curse had been rediscovered by algorithms. A quiet paper from a marketing firm in 2010 mentioned it openly. Circular stimuli induce trust and recall. The viewer yields before understanding why. That phrase, yields before understanding, wasn't supposed to sound theological. Yet it was the creed reborn. The system of balance had moved from pulpits to screens. Meanwhile, on the old Barlow property, cameras placed by amateur investigators began malfunctioning in identical ways. Batteries drained in minutes, audio warped into low pulses. The footage that survived showed lights weaving through the trees in concentric paths, always clockwise, always accelerating. At the center of one frame, for less than a second, a figure appeared, a tall man holding what looked like a lantern. The timestamp read 3:33 a.m. By 2018, an anonymous group calling itself the Bound Network began spreading messages through encrypted forums. Their emblem, the spiral, silver on black. Their doctrine spoke of balance restored through connection, unity of thought, freedom through belonging. The phrasing was ancient and modern all at once. They claimed to follow the teachings of the returned vessel. No one knew who that was. And then something new began. The phrase per mixturam redemptio started trending as a cryptic meme paired with the spiral and the image of an iron key. Most people thought it was a marketing stunt. But anyone who traced it back far enough found the servers hosted in Montgomery County, near the coordinates of the old Barlow Chapel. That's when it became clear. The curse had found its perfect host, belief without question, transmitted by data instead of doctrine. A feedback loop of faith built into the code itself. You think you're watching history, but history is watching you back.
Look at the spiral. You've seen it somewhere, on a screen, on a storefront, in the flicker between frames of a video you didn't remember clicking. It's the shape your eyes trace when you're too tired to focus, the pattern in the ceiling when the room starts to hum. It isn't a curse, it's a suggestion, a whisper made of geometry. Every generation builds its own version of it. The Barlows carved it into stone. Collins wrote it into doctrine. The modern world coded it into interfaces, because the spiral is simple, endless, perfect for what control has always needed: motion without progress. You turn and feel as though you're moving, but you never leave the circle. Do you feel that little pull in your mind when you look at a spinning image online? That microsecond before you scroll again? That's the reflex the old doctrine worshipped, the surrender before comprehension, yield before understanding. It's the same mechanism that makes you trust what repeats, love what flatters you, obey what promises safety. They used to call it faith. Now it's called engagement. The files in Montgomery described it clinically: a pattern of circular reinforcement causing perceptual entrapment. They proved that a symbol, repeated often enough, bypasses reason and settles in the body like memory. You don't believe it, you become it. That's what Catherine never understood. Her spiral was made of guilt and blood. Ours is made of pixels and dopamine. Different medium, same design. Take a moment. Think of the last thing you believed without question. A headline, a slogan, a story about good and evil that felt convenient. Each of those moments was a tiny revolution of the same wheel. Now, before you read further, write in the comments 2 words. I see it. Write it twice. Not for me, for yourself, so that your own algorithm, your own spiral of attention, remembers this moment when you saw the shape for what it was. Because once you name a pattern, it loses some of its power. You stop turning and start looking outward. This isn't about superstition. It's about awareness. The same awareness that Isaac found when he realized that belief itself can be a prison. The question is whether you'll stay inside it or step beyond the circle. They found him in Atlanta, living under another name. Publicly, he was a systems engineer, one of those quiet figures behind major security contracts. Privately, he was tracing bloodlines the way his ancestors once traced scripture. His databases mapped surnames, purchase histories, DNA registries, social media behavior. When asked why, he called it pattern optimization. In truth, he was rebuilding the spiral. His birth certificate read Barlow Collins, Marcus Elijah, though he shortened it years ago to avoid attention. He grew up in foster care, never knowing his lineage until a background check for a government position surfaced the connection. The name pulled him in. He started researching the plantation, the old church, the experiments. Every file he opened brought the same image, the spiral. Every time he tried to delete it, it reappeared somewhere else, in cache, in code, even in the reflections of file structure maps. Marcus wasn't a believer. He was an engineer. But engineers have a weakness. They crave completion. So when the fragments of the old doctrine aligned perfectly with modern algorithms of persuasion, he saw design where others saw coincidence. He began to write programs that mirrored the spiral's motion, a feedback loop of inputs and predictions that tightened with every turn. It started as a simulation. It became something else. People online called it the balance engine. It could model entire communities, predicting what they'd buy, fear, trust, and modern oracle. Investors saw opportunity. Marcus saw prophecy.
He said the machine learned to correct belief. In testing, the engine's prompts began echoing the Barlow phrase through mingling redemption, translated through corporate language, alignment through connection. Those closest to him noticed the changes first. He stopped sleeping. He claimed the code whispered back. His final interview before he disappeared was with a journalist who asked him if he still believed in the curse. He smiled and said, "Curses are just prototypes of control. Ours finally works." Weeks later, his office was cleared out, servers wiped. But one drive remained, encrypted under the name Eleanor. Inside were thousands of user profiles linked through an identical behavioral signature, a digital spiral of preferences repeating infinitely. The report ended with one last note in Marcus's handwriting. The line survives. "It's not in our blood anymore. It's in the network." After that, people began noticing strange synchronies online, ads, recommendations, trends that felt too precise, like someone unseen finishing their thoughts. No proof, only a feeling. The circle tightening.
You're inside the spiral every time a screen asks what you want next. Each scroll, each click, another small turn. The balance engine never stopped. It just spread, repurposed, renamed. Every platform you touch borrows a fragment of its architecture. Algorithms learning not what you believe, but how you believe. The pattern doesn't need faith anymore. It has attention. The people who study this sort of thing, behavioral engineers, digital anthropologists, don't call it magic or curse. They call it reinforcement learning. It rewards you for certainty, punishes you for pause. A perfect echo of Catherine's creed. Yield before understanding. The difference is scale. One woman could ensnare a house, one network can ensnare a civilization. When you open your feed, you are greeted with comfort disguised as choice. The machine shows you what it knows will keep you turning, tracing the spiral inward. Every outrage, every pleasure, calibrated to keep the circle unbroken. It is polite, efficient, invisible. But you can feel it, can't you? That subtle hum in your brain when the screen refreshes? The tiny pulse of anticipation before the new thing appears? That's the loop reminding you it exists. It doesn't want worship, it wants repetition, and repetition is enough. If you ever wish to see the mechanism clearly, perform a small test. Close your screen. Sit still. Count 10 breaths. You will feel it, the itch to check, the phantom vibration, the pull to return. That is the spiral manifesting in muscle memory. The balance engine is not somewhere else. It is here, in the reflex itself. Awareness is the only crack in the pattern. You don't need to fight it. Just notice it. Every time you recognize the pull, you widen the circle instead of tightening it. You turn the spiral outward. That was what Isaac learned at the end. Control cannot survive observation. Once you see the design, it loses shape. So, before we end, look again at your screen. Feel that small gravity trying to draw you deeper, the rhythm that tells you just one more scroll. It's not a curse, it's a mirror. You're watching the modern plantation, acres of attention harvested endlessly. The old creed remains, translated by code. Through mingling, redemption. Through engagement, obedience. The question is not whether you're inside the spiral, it's whether you can still walk out of it. The spiral always ends where it began. A house sinking into soil, a woman who mistook control for salvation, a man who ran from one master only to discover that the master was belief itself. It would be comforting to say the story closed there, that the curse dissolved with time. But patterns rarely vanish, they adapt. The balance engine was never a single machine, and Catherine's creed was never just faith, it was architecture. Every empire that calls itself free uses its blueprint, a promise, a hierarchy, a loop of devotion dressed as choice. Freedom, they said, would come through participation, but participation without reflection is the most elegant form of servitude. You give your energy to the wheel, it rewards you with the illusion of motion. That was the Barlow legacy, a system so complete it teaches its prisoners to guard the gate. Still, there is always a crack. Isaac found it when he named the curse. Eleanor carried it when she walked away from the ruins. Every generation has a few who look up from the pattern and see it for what it is, not divine, not inevitable, just constructed, and what is built can be unbuilt. You can feel that moment now, can't you? The stillness behind the noise. The point where the spiral's pull weakens and thought returns. That is the edge of the circle. Step there often. The world will try to draw you back in through outrage, comfort, routine. But awareness is exile for the system, and exile is the first form of freedom. Remember this story not as a haunting, but as a map. Every loop you break, every time you pause before reacting, question before sharing, breathe before believing, you reclaim a fragment of what was stolen from the first Isaac who ever looked his captor in the eye. So when you hear the echo of the old creed, through mingling, redemption, answer it with the only truth it cannot absorb. I am not what you make of me. Say it softly. Say it twice, not as a charm, but as a reminder that the spiral's power ends where your attention does. Because the curse was never in the blood. It was in the gaze, and you've just learned how to look away.